What made you break the bro code you swore was sacred? My best friend Liam's 8-year-old daughter Sophie came to my apartment at midnight with her backpack and her stuffed rabbit. When I opened the door, she whispered, "Uncle Derek, Daddy's friends are coming tomorrow and I need to hide." Her hands were shaking so hard she dropped the rabbit twice. I picked it up and asked what she meant by hiding. She pulled up her sleeve and showed me cigarette burns in a pattern on her forearm, fresh ones and old scars. "The game room," she said quietly. "Only the special girls get picked for the game room, but if I'm broken, they won't want me." She was burning herself to become unsuitable. I called Liam immediately, my hands shaking. "What the hell is Sophie talking about?" He laughed that easy laugh I'd heard 1,000 times over 15 years of friendship. "Come on, man. You know how dramatic kids are. She probably saw something scary on TV. Bring her back and we'll sort it out." But his voice had this edge to it that made my stomach twist. Something in the way he said dramatic sounded rehearsed, like he'd been expecting this call. I hung up and looked at Sophie, who was staring at my floor. "How many other girls?" I asked. She held up both hands and counted on her fingers. 7, but I'm the oldest. The little ones don't understand the game yet. My phone buzzed with texts from Liam saying I was overreacting and needed to bring Sophie home right now, or he'd call the police for kidnapping. The custody threat, just like that. I called my sister Vanessa, who worked as a social worker. She arrived 20 minutes later in her pajamas and immediately photographed Sophie's arms. The burns were deliberate, spaced evenly, clearly not accidental. Vanessa's face went pale when Sophie described the game room in Liam's basement, how the men would arrive on Friday nights after the mothers dropped off their daughters, how Liam would choose which girl got picked based on who looked prettiest that week. Sophie said she'd been burning herself for 3 weeks trying to make herself ugly enough to avoid selection. Vanessa called her supervisor while I sat with Sophie, who was falling asleep on my couch. My phone kept buzzing with Liam's messages getting angrier. He said I was destroying our friendship over nothing, that Sophie had behavioral issues and made up stories for attention, that his lawyer would have me arrested by morning. But I couldn't ignore what I'd seen on that little girl's arm, or the terror in her voice when she talked about tomorrow night. The supervisor arrived at 1 in the morning and took Sophie's statement while recording everything. Sophie described 7 other girls whose mothers had weekend custody arrangements with their fathers. She named each girl and said they all tried different ways to make themselves less attractive. One girl, Mia, had pulled out chunks of her own hair. Another named Zoe wore dirty clothes and refused to bathe. They were 8-year-old children trying to protect themselves from something they didn't have words to describe. The supervisor called the police, and 2 officers showed up an hour later. They took Sophie to the hospital for a medical exam while I gave my statement about how she'd arrived. The officers seemed skeptical at first, treating it like a custody dispute rather than abuse. But when they saw the burns and heard Sophie's consistent story about the game room and the other girls, their attitude shifted. One officer called for a detective, while the other started making notes about the pattern Sophie had described. Detective Rita Alvarez arrived at the hospital at 3 in the morning. She was maybe 45 with gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that had seen everything. She interviewed Sophie for an hour while a special